Welcome to today's Global Links program and the LGBT Center's annual Mark D. Gordon Lecture on the Oscar-nominated documentary film Flee, which I hope all of you watched in anticipation of participating in today's program. During our program, we'll discuss this award-winning documentary that tells a very human story of escape, love, trauma, and resilience. It recounts the life story of Afghan refugee Amin Nawabi as he grapples with the secret that threatens to disrupt his life, or rather the life he has built for himself in Denmark with his future husband. We also want to thank or give thanks to our university co-sponsors for this event, the LGBT Center and the Wolf Humanities Center. Please welcome or join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Cross, Director of the LGBT Center, who will introduce our esteemed speakers. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, LaShawn. As LaShawn noted, today's program is the LGBT Center's annual Mark D. Gordon Lecture. Thank you to Mark for his generosity in making this event possible. I'd also like to thank Perry Worldhouse for hosting this year's program and to the Wolf Humanities Center for co-sponsoring. I get the great task of introducing our speakers today. I'm delighted to welcome an old friend, Fernando Chang-Muy, and a new one, Reid, for this important discussion. Fernando Chang-Muy is the Thomas O'Boyle Lecturer in Law at Penn's Law School, where he teaches international human rights with a focus on international and U.S. refugee law. At Penn's Graduate School of Social Policy and Practice, he teaches separate courses on U.S. law and policy overview, as well as a course on U.S. immigration law. Before coming to Penn, he served as former legal officer with UNHCR, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as the Human Rights Legal Officer with the WHO, the UN World Health Organization AIDS program. Graeme Reid is the Director of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. An expert on LGBTQ rights, he has conducted research, taught, and published extensively on gender, sexuality, LGBT issues, and HIV/AIDS. He's the author of How to Be a Real Gay, Gay Identities in Small Town South Africa. Before joining Human Rights Watch in 2011, Reid was the founding director of Gay and Lesbian Archives of South Africa.
Welcome all, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here instead of outside where we should all be, but thank you for being here, those of you here and those of you in the Zoom room, and thanks to Erin and LaShawn for inviting us. And especially also thanks to our colleagues at Perry Worldhouse, Tom, Shattuck, and Philippe Atala for putting all this together. So Graeme, thank you for coming in from New York. I assume you all saw the film, so let me just ask you an open-ended question. What do you think about the movie, and maybe from a human rights perspective?
Well, firstly, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm thrilled to be here today. And I was also delighted to have an opportunity to finally see the film. I admit that I declined an invitation from a friend on the grounds that it was an animated film, and I thought it's not going to be very engaging. But I was completely wrong. Of course, it is an incredibly engaging film. And I was very struck by the opening sentence, in fact, is that what is the meaning of home for you? And so that theme of home and of being pushed out of home initially. It also happened serendipitously that yesterday I received the latest Lapham's Quarterly, which is indeed on migration. And I was struck by this very short line from a poem by Warson Shire: "No one leaves home unless home chases you," referring to the situation of refugees. And I thought that really resonated strongly in terms of the initial aspect of the film of that being forced out of home, but then in the precariousness of place as the family tries to find another home. For example, in the experiences in Russia and the extreme risks that people are willing and indeed need to make in order to find safety and sanctuary elsewhere. And also the very limited options that are available. Also just happens that in Lapham's quarterly, it mentioned that Afghanistan ranked the lowest in terms of visa-free entry requirements, that there are 26 countries in the world in 2006 in which Afghan citizens could enter without a visa. And so that comes across in the film, the very limited opportunities. But then a broader idea about home that came across is the fear of family rejection. And that's where the idea of a concealed identity of being gay and not being able to be open about being gay comes across very strongly, and again resonates with this idea of home. Amir mentions the idea that homosexuals don't exist in Afghanistan, this idea of extreme secrecy, the idea of bringing shame on the family, and then living constantly with this fear of family rejection. And that resonated for me because a lot of work that we do in terms of migration in the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch, often the fear of family rejection or the experience of family rejection and the experience of community rejection is one of the factors that distinguishes the LGBT experience of migration. So, you know, in many instances, migrants will turn to family and community for support in the experience of displacement and of migration, but those options are limited or sometimes absent for LGBT people. And of course, in this particular scenario, the story turns out more positively in the unexpected embrace of the family. But that's not always the situation. And then the other aspect that I would just like to briefly touch on is the theme of secrets and lies, the kinds of false narratives that he needed to make because of what the smuggler told him to do, and having to sustain that narrative, the idea that he didn't have a family, but how that also poignantly resonated with his fear of, you know, whether he had a family or not, if he revealed his secret. So those aspects really stood out for me, and I wonder what resonated for you.
Well, thanks for the question. Did we plan this, that you would ask me? So thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say that just 4 or 5 weeks ago, Afghanistan was in the news. For those of you at Penn, spring break was started the first week of March. And before that, Afghanistan was in the news. You saw people, Afghans trying to jump into the airport in Afghanistan, trying to find protection, come to the US, come the Ukrainian crisis. We forget about Afghanistan, and now the whole focus is on Ukraine. And before Afghanistan, the focus was on Haitians trying to get into our southern border. So Haitians, then Afghanis, we forgot about them, and now we're all thinking about Ukraine, despite the fact that the European Union has given Ukrainians 3 years to stay in Ukraine. Maybe we'll touch upon that later, but I'm so glad that Aaron LaShawn chose this movie to talk about even before this. So it's really appropriate to talk about this movie. I too felt like you did, oh, it's animated. Like, you know, I think I'm an adult, but I love the film. And I was wondering as I was watching it, how would I have felt if it was real people enacting this? I think it would have been too much to see people leaving on a boat or trying to cross a real forest, getting on a boat. The woman, we're left with the impression that she was raped. So I'm glad that it was animated just for that reason. So the movie spoke to me, of course, from an immigration perspective. I should say that, you know, I see everything through an immigration and refugee lens. On Friday, I think, is the beginning of Passover. And so whenever I'm invited to a Passover Seder, I think this is about immigration. I see a trash can and I see immigration. So this was definitely, I mean, it was about immigration. It was also about non-immigration issues like family and being LGBT and constructing a story because you're LGBT and lying. It's everything you said. I know that many people, in order to get protection in the country they flee to, they will say whatever they think the government authority wants to hear in order for them to get protection. So he said, as you pointed out, my family's dead. My father was killed, my mother was killed, my brother was inducted into the army, all lies. Should he not have gotten asylum in Denmark because he lied? But again, people in vulnerable, precarious situations have to lie. So from a legal perspective, that could, if later he's found out and he lives with this fear, even into his adult life, that his ex-boyfriend is going to snitch on him, that is also an added point of trauma. So anyway, the movie spoke to me from the legal perspective. It showed the challenges that people have to face when they leave. They go from country A to country B go to country C. So in his case, he goes from Afghanistan to Russia, then trying to leave Russia and going to Copenhagen. And that is the trajectory that many people face, from Haiti to maybe the Bahamas, and then, or Jamaica, and then from the Bahamas or Jamaica, try to get resettled into Miami, or from Ethiopia to a refugee camp in Kenya, and then from Kenya, try to be resettled in West Philadelphia, which is why there's so many Ethiopian restaurants in West Philly. So this story that we saw is being repeated throughout in different continents. And had he been honest, and maybe he didn't have the words as a young person, in the legal refugee world, you can be a refugee if you show that you have a fear that is well-founded. You're not a crazy schizophrenic, well-founded fear of being persecuted. And it's based on 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. So this teenager who goes from Afghanistan to Russia to Copenhagen, had he had legal representation or some know your rights, he could have said, and be honest, I have a well-founded fear of persecution because of my social group. My social group is I'm gay, and if you send me back to Afghanistan, I will be killed. But of course, he didn't even have the words, the terminology to talk about this. And the other thing that the film spoke to me about the film was what we call in the refugee world the triple trauma paradigm. Fancy words for he suffered trauma in his country of origin. His father was disappeared. He suffered trauma in the flight to the second country, going through the forest, then living in Moscow and being harassed by the corrupt Moscow police. And then the third trauma is in the new country, Copenhagen. He doesn't speak the language. He's alone. So the trauma in the country of origin, the trauma of flight, and the trauma in the new country. So the movie captured all this in 90 minutes. So I really loved it. So let me turn it back to you. Could you talk more about the depiction of the human rights violation in Afghanistan, or the human rights violation in Moscow, if your work has taken you to human rights violation in either Afghanistan or Russia? Were the filmmakers right? Did they get it right? Or if you could just comment on from your professional experience in human rights, how did the movie rate?
Well, I think, earlier this year, Human Rights Watch, together with Outright Action International, published a report on Afghanistan. And it was a report that documented experiences of LGBT people living in Afghanistan before the Taliban takeover, and then subsequent to the Taliban takeover. And it interviewed some 60 people, both within Afghanistan and those who had managed to flee, but who were living still in very precarious situations with visas that were about to expire in countries in which same-sex activity is illegal, and who found themselves in a situation of limbo. And in the film, reference is made to, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that that this is deeply secretive and hidden. So the idea that A, this doesn't exist in Afghanistan, but B, the sense of shame and the rejection by family and community. And certainly what the research showed was that this did reflect the experience, or rather the film accurately reflected the kinds of experiences that people have had even before the Taliban takeover, but it has certainly been exacerbated since the Taliban takeover, and people find themselves in an extremely vulnerable position, of course, with absolutely no legal protection, and with authorities within the Taliban making, very strong anti-LGBT statements. It's very rare that in a kind of Human Rights Watch report that we see few viable alternatives but to leave. And of course, that's not something that is an option open to all LGBT people in Afghanistan. But the situation in Afghanistan is so dire that it's hard to imagine being able to live there, certainly not openly as an LGBT person. And the kinds of abuses that we documented are abuses within the family, precisely what is pointed out in the film, a kind of sense of shame, but that shame can translate into violence, including honor killing. We documented experiences of forced marriage, of lesbians who were forced into marriage, and also gay men who were forced into marriage because the alternative would be basically an honor killing situation in the cases that we documented. We've also done extensive work in Russia. I think of significance, and what I would highlight here in Russia is the passage of the propaganda law, the law that outlaws propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships in the vicinity of children. Now, in the vicinity of children suggests that this is a way of protecting children. What our reports what our reporting has shown is that far from protecting children, is that this law makes certainly LGBT kids very vulnerable, and it has a stifling effect on expression in general. And then, of course, Putin has been very successful in using the propaganda law domestically to consolidate a conservative support base, but also internationally by taking on the mantle of defending so-called traditional values. And this goes to the heart of an ongoing contestation, which we see around the world and including in the UN, this idea that somehow LGBT rights are relegated to the zone of culture, tradition, and morality, and not seen in terms of human rights at all. And so that creates a very extreme situation for many LGBT people around the world, in which LGBT rights are kind of seen as a shorthand for a broader contestation around traditional values and human rights. So I think in those respects that the film certainly portrayed accurately the kinds of experiences that the protagonist describes. I would also just mention one other report that we've done in Chechnya, which is a semi-autonomous region in Russia, which has been really extreme, and in which the leader there, Kadyrov, had under his leadership a number of gay men. We documented more than 100 who had been rounded up, kept in informal detention facilities, subject to torture and various forms of humiliation, including at their release inviting male family members primarily, and then detailing the kinds of information that the interrogators had got under torture, including details of their sexual lives, etc., in front of their male relatives, with the clear intent that this is a shameful act and that the family should act. And the unstated was being that these people should be subject to kind of honor killing in that situation.
So, this sounds weird, but the worse that you're being treated in your country of origin, the better chance you have of winning asylum when you leave. So everything you said, if someone from Chechnya, if someone from Russia, if someone from Afghanistan were able to get out of Russia or Afghanistan and said, I have a well-founded fear of persecution. What's the persecution? I'll be tortured. I'll be hung upside down. My own family will do this, or the soldiers will do this. And I have a well-founded fear of persecution because of my social group. What's my social group? Is I'm gay or I'm lesbian. the more we can use your reports, which are great, that you're backing up my statement, the more likelihood that people have of winning a case for asylum. So if anyone in the room or anyone in Zoom knows anyone from these countries where they are LGBT, if they can prove it, and we sort of have proof through your reports, which are great for lawyers or for asylum seekers, we can use reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the New York Times clipping on something or other. That helps to support or buttress a claim for asylum. So thanks for Human Rights Watch for doing all its work. We have a few more minutes left before we turn it over to the folks here in the room or in the Zoom room. Okay, so now what? So the movie took place, in the 80s, Taliban, Russia. It then moves to the present where they live he and his friend live happily ever after. But can you leave the folks in the room or the folks in the Zoom room with like, what can we as students, as teachers, just as people, is there anything we can do? So I like to think of my friends in the School of Public Health. They say that to get rid of a disease, it's 3 steps: knowledge, attitude, and behavior. So to get rid of HIV/AIDS or diabetes, we raise your knowledge, okay? Knowledge about what is HIV, what is diabetes. That might change your attitude about sugar, and that might change my behavior. I'm not going to drink Coke. So now that we know about what's going on in Afghanistan or Russia, that's the knowledge part. And thanks for Human Rights Watch for raising our awareness. What is the behavior change that so now maybe I'll change my attitude. Maybe Moscow isn't that good, or Afghanistan isn't that. So knowledge has been raised by your reports. That might change my attitude about treatment of LGBT people. So what is the behavior change that you could recommend that we engage in? Because thank you for all your reports, but I haven't read them. And so we need to move on to the trajectory to action. Mm-hmm. So what can we do now that we've seen this movie, now that we have your reports? Any suggestions you have for the folks in the room?
I mean, the one practical suggestion I would have is that there are groups that work specifically with LGBT refugees. One that we worked with, in fact, on the report in Afghanistan is Rainbow Railroad, which is based in Canada. It's a very effective group that works in many parts of the world and also has quite innovative approaches. So not just looking at the typical resettlement routes, but looking at countries like Argentina, for example, South Africa, thinking about regional options for people who need to move. And they've been very effective in several individual cases that we've been dealing with, as well as the bigger cases such as in Afghanistan. Actually, this was an interesting challenge for us from a research point of view, because we worked with Rainbow Railroad in interviewing those people who had managed to escape and were staying in a neighboring country. And actually, the interviews that we conducted also served the purpose of intake interviews. Now, this provided for us a methodological challenge because we were concerned about combining an interview for a human rights report with an interview that in effect was also a kind of intake interview, and what kind of, what did we need to keep in mind in terms of ensuring the kind of veracity of the stories and the implications of doing an interview that also had a specific intent. So there's that. And then I think that, just simply the knowledge and awareness of what is happening can be in and of itself important. And the Chechnya example again comes to mind because the primary purpose of that report, we weren't going to bring about change in Chechnya, and we don't expect that this report is going to bring about change in Afghanistan, but it has been helpful in a number of cases
legal services person. It's everybody collaborating to make the lives of people better. Before we open it up, the last thing I'll say is before COVID, I'm at the law school and I'm the faculty advisor to a couple of student groups. And one of them is the International Human Rights Advocates, that's their name. And every year they choose, before COVID, they choose a different country to investigate human rights violations. So right before COVID, the students themselves choose the country. They chose Greece. And they chose Greece to work with the Afghans who went from Afghanistan by boat, by train, by truck. They travel through Iran. They arrive in Turkey, then they get on little rafts in Turkey to try to get to the closest part of Europe, which is the island of Lesbos in Greece. And Lesbos is so close to Turkey that sometimes when we were walking on a hill in Lesbos, Greece, my phone said, "Welcome to Turkey." But anyway, my students interviewed Afghans in Turkey, and 2 of them had claims for asylum based on being LGBT in Afghanistan. But the problem that we heard was that when the Greek authorities interviewed the Afghans, why did you leave? Why didn't you stay in Iran? Why didn't you? How do you prove that you're gay? And so applications from asylum seekers because of their sexual orientation is difficult. Nevertheless, many have won. There are reported cases in Canada, there are reported cases in the United States, and of course all over Europe, where people have said, I have a well-founded fear of persecution because of my social group. Don't send me back to my country of origin. And these folks have won and some have lost. So it's 4:30, I believe, and we're right on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Technology can't live with it, can't live without
So
it.
I'm happy to get things started, and I'm shouting because bear with us if you're online, bear with us if you're in the room. So I found the film extremely moving, sad in ways that I had imagined and sad in ways that I hadn't imagined. We were doing our own analysis on our way down in the elevator, and I thought there was some gender. Russia, and I think they were trying to get to Sweden, and a Norwegian cruise liner passes them by. And the animation is phenomenal because you see the cruise liner approaching. There's a little boat, and they're desperate on this boat. But Amir remembers and recounts the shame of needing help. The shame of being the person on the other side of that. And how happy the people were in the boat were because they thought they were going to be rescued. But that he stood there with his mother, at least that's how it was in the film, just thinking of being very ashamed. And I think that oftentimes when we think about asylum processes and immigration, we, assume that people leave their homes lightly, and they don't. And this movie reminds us of that. And in fact, at some point in the story, he says that fleeing destroys you. If you can imagine the paradox of fleeing being something it destroys you because you're leaving something that means a lot to you. And the precarity that then kind of defines important parts of your life, and the idea of being in such desperate need and and of being kind of at the mercy of people. You're at the mercy of the traffickers, you're at the mercy of the strugglers, you're at the mercy of immigration asylum officials, and that you're always at someone's mercy. And I think it's hard if you're not either immersed in it professionally, to understand in the depths of kind of your heart what it is to just be so much at the mercy of other people. So my takeaway was that there has to be a pristine asylum or refugee story. Life is complex and complicated, and people do what they have to do to survive. But the individual story represents millions of stories around the world. So I was very grateful. I didn't have the same rejection of animation per se. I just didn't have any time. So I was happy that I had to find the time to watch it, because it reminded me of all those things. I didn't really have a question. I guess that was a statement, and I'm modeling bad behavior for you. So please ask an actual question.
Or not, or,
or share your sentiments. Here first. It was a moving movie. You must have something to say. You're sitting here today. You have come out on a glorious day, and you're in this room with us.
And we only have 20 minutes left.
But
Graeme,
your statement does provoke something for me, which is something I've been thinking about a lot during the course of our work, is the ways in which, out of necessity, a human rights report focuses on abuses.
Yes.
And often focuses on incidents of violence. Yes. And so what is left out of that? And what's left out of that is the kind of resilience, the creativity that people embrace and engage with in order to live their lives in sometimes extremely difficult circumstances. Yeah. And so I think the film also brought that to the fore.
Yes.
But now that you have this position, you can, on the last page or the last chapter of a human rights report, devote a chapter to people's resiliency. So not just focus on the negative, but focus also, and when refugees leave Afghanistan and end up in Denmark, yay, and this is what we see, which then is a pat on the back for the receiving countries. Yes. You're giving them positive reinforcement so that they can take more people. But, LaShawn, I want to say to your point, the act of fleeing was embarrassing to Amin. It decreases self-esteem. So in my country of origin, I was a doctor, I was an engineer, I was a teacher, and now I'm washing dishes at the restaurant. And so that also has an impact on family dynamics. So in my country of origin, for straight or maybe even gay couples, I was the breadwinner. Now my wife is doing hair braiding because we're from Senegal. She's earning, $400 a pop, and I can't find a job because I only speak repercussions. And it's the triple trauma, the trauma that I left, the trauma in the flight, and now the trauma here in Philly, where I can't get a job, but somebody else can, and my degrees are not credentialed. By the way, when the hurricane hit in New Orleans, people were leaving Louisiana and going to Texas, and the newspapers originally were calling them refugees. And there was a big pushback on the part of Americans. I'm not a refugee. Like, I'm an American citizen from Louisiana. So don't. So who knows? Other comments or questions? Jordan.
Right. I work here at Fairhold House, and I was wondering, you talked in the beginning about how, with the quotation about how home chases you, and I was wondering, what either of you thought the film sort of said, like what the film said about what home is, and where is home, and where did that idea of home, especially when you're a refugee, especially when you experience issues so intersectionally.
And I thought that the film was a kind of meditation on the idea of home, really, because it resonated on so many different levels, because it was also about a mere sort of feeling at peace with himself, or kind of coming to terms with his sexuality, and in relation not only to himself, but also in relation to his family. And, that idea that he couldn't move into what appeared to be a kind of rural idyll, but that he was afraid of a kind of depression of living there. And then also his strong sense of obligation to his family. What did he belong? What did he owe to his family? And also, what was his status within the family because of the secret that he held? And then just, yeah, the idea more sort of literally of like how to establish a home, like how to, and the family ends up being scattered, right, throughout Europe. So what does it mean then to, what is home in that?
I want to take it to you, but to Jared's point, so Passover starts soon, and I know that in a Passover Seder, next year we're going to do this in Jerusalem. I'm from Miami, and all the Miami Cubans say next year we're going to do Christmas in Cuba. Well, we've been saying that for 61 years. So what is home, or the thought of home? Take it away.
I'm Kiara.
Can you stand up?
Oh, yeah.
And make sure you project.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm Kiara. I'm part of the graduate school of education. I'm also on the exec team of Lambda Grads, which is the LGBT Alliance Center for Graduate Students. During my undergrad, I did an ethnographic study with refugee women in Portland, Oregon, where I interviewed them about their experiences. What resonated to me was this conversation about lies, and how during the interviews, the women felt comfortable disclosing their queer status. However, during their refugee resettlement process, they did not. So I guess my question is kind of a roundabout kind of way, is like, how can we promote or better support this kind of tension between seeking asylum and gaining asylum, and also coming out and like having that identity? Yeah, thank you.
And there's a question related to this. It's after Amin got to the safety of Denmark, he had to continue the lie of saying his family was dead. Can you comment more on the trauma of having to continue to live that lie, even after he's relatively safe? His trauma was a decades-long issue, living that lie of having no family. And you alluded to that. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, because it's certainly not straightforward. The idea that you can claim asylum on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, but the actual practical and difficulties that people face in doing your sexual orientation or gender identity a secret. And then the first interaction you have in the country that you flee to is with an official who holds your future in their hands, and you're going to suddenly come out and say what it is that you are, the basis on which you're claiming asylum. Currently, we are doing a report in South Africa looking at the experiences of LGBT asylum seekers from other countries on the continent who's seeking asylum in South Africa, precisely because South Africa has a very progressive refugee law that explicitly recognizes sexual orientation and gender identity. But asylum is very different from the policy and from what the policy and law would suggest. And it comes back to a point you were making earlier, is officials seeking how to prove that somebody is who they say they are. And then, you know, just to give you a couple of examples, one applicant was rejected from Zambia, who had very credible grounds for seeking asylum, who was rejected because he had a lot of girlfriends, like friends who were women, because that person said, well, if you're a gay man, why would you be like hanging out with women? That was like, I mean. And then the second was that he said he was Christian. I said, well, you can't be gay and Christian. So this is sort of on the level of the sort of bureaucracy and administrators, in which, and then in other instances, people saying, well, you don't look gay. So people kind of like dressing up and camping it up to try and be what they think they need to be in order for the person to accept their claim as credible. Also, a number of people have to work with interpreters, and those interpreters come from the countries and communities, precisely the communities that the people are fleeing. So, you know, that's another obstacle to being open about your sexual orientation or gender identity, and also a lack of discretion amongst officials who, you know, might not be as discreet as they need to be. So people feel very threatened. Even in situations in which, as I say, that the law and policy is on their side, but the practical aspects of actually claiming asylum and getting the credibility approved is very complicated. And of course, there have been very peculiar ways of trying to prove that people are gay. In the UK, it's changed now, but one of the questions was about Oscar Wilde, as if it's a sort of universal kind of
Known quantity.
yeah.
So if you know Oscar Wilde, that means that you're gay.
Yeah.
Right, so here's your refugee card. So, based on everything that has been said, you can imagine all the mental health and maybe even physical health issues that refugees are facing. Maybe the lies, maybe my family doesn't know that I'm gay. Maybe how do I tell the story to someone I don't even know? So all of these things. And so it's a miracle that people make it and are resilient despite all the traumas that they have faced in the country war and in the flood.
I'm Reid, and I've worked as an analyst to data analyst at Penn Engineering School. I haven't watched the movie, but why did you choose the animation versus having real actors? Was it the cost that prevented you from doing this, and did it have the impact that you wanted to create? You told the story, you created awareness about the story of this boy, and through multiple angles and multiple dimensions. But did it have the impact that you wanted to have?
So we didn't make the movie. I mean, we're just talking about the movie. But actually this weekend, I was with what would she be? She's my niece-in-law. And she's making an animated film based on an Alaskan story. She didn't want to use the word myth, but it's like a story that's told by natives in Alaska. And they're going to do animation. And she was talking about all the real actors film, and it's slightly cheaper. You've got to find the script writer, you've got to find the animator, the music, so it's still expensive, but I can't answer your question. But Aaron, why for this important annual thing, why did you choose this film on refugees and not on something else and animate it?
It's something that is not talked about in our community. To bring that to light, that LGBTQ issues we hear about in other countries, it's bad. Yes, they should immigrate, but we don't.
And we stereotype that Central Americans arriving in the US are poor. Actually, you have to be middle class to leave Honduras and come to the United States, because through Mexico to northern Mexico to California, New Mexico, Texas, or Arizona was $5,000. I also learned that because Honduras is a former colony of Spain, there's no visa requirements to go from Central America to Spain. So if you were middle class, you could buy yourself a package, a 15-day tour to Spain, which is $2,000, which includes airfare, breakfast, lunch, and dinner at hotels. But then working, doing home health care with older Spanish people. Men go north to do landscaping, and Honduran middle-class women go left, and their trafficker is a travel agency. So all over Honduras there is, do you want to go to Spain? Come, we'll get you a Honduran passport, we'll get you airfare to Spain. And so the women go left go to Spain, the men go north to the United States. So, and you have to use a trafficker. In Spanish, the word is coyote, to get you China, to Thailand, to Hong Kong, to Panama, to whatever. So, and so the word that this person posted is unsavory. That's a euphemism. We've got about 4 minutes left. Anything else before we start wrapping up? Any other comments? Or somebody here? Tell us your name and stand up. Yep, speak loud.
You had your hand at first. And
Yeah,
yes.
happy to field you.
Okay, it was,
Please.
okay. So my name is Allison Schmidt. I'm a lecturer in the IR department, and the first thing I
What
thought-
does IR stand for?
International Relations.
Got it.
Thank you. So the first thing I noticed when I started watching this movie is its similarity with the movie Persepolis. I don't know. Yeah, and what I thought was really fascinating is both movies are told through the receiving culture, or that's like primarily the producers of this movie. And so I was wondering if you had any comments on that, and also just using this movie as, you don't have to answer the second question, but using this movie as a potential teaching tool. If
Often, so traditional law school teaching is the stage on stage. So I actually use a lot of film clips in the way I teach. I have students do site visits. We interview people in prison. I have guest speakers. So definitely I will use clips of this movie, though I have to buy Hulu. Of an asylum seeker. So definitely it's a teaching, I could use it as a teaching tool.
So I haven't seen Persepolis. I haven't seen it. The one film that does come to mind that is different from what you're describing in terms of focusing on the technology, back to the earlier question, that it's not around animation, but is a sort of sophisticated technology whereby actors' faces are kind of superimposed on the actual characters so that it's indistinguishable. It's kind of a little bit eerie, but that's a way of both retaining the emotional connection with an actual person and recognizing that these people are extreme risk and that there's no way that their identities can be revealed at all. And so that was one of the innovative strategies and techniques used to be able to make a documentary about people who are extremely vulnerable and cannot afford to have their identities revealed in any way.
And last comment or question, tell us your name. Stand up, speak loud.
My name is Chris. I work at the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives. My question is about one of the themes that I think has been kind of weaving through this discussion. And it's about how we've recognized in many different ways how the within their home can be very dehumanizing. And we've also discussed ways in which this particular film has brought the humanity back into the experience for both those who are fleeing and those who are receiving. I'm curious to know from both of your vantage points and perspectives, to receive them in radical ways.
Well,
Amir processing his trauma. His sisters perhaps had experienced some trauma. His mother had experienced trauma. So maybe embedding in the answers like the types of services that refugees and asylum.
that is such an important question. So I have two responses. The one is the value of individual stories. And certainly in our reporting and our human rights reporting, we focus very much on this happened to this person, this is their family circumstance, to humanize an otherwise very abstract story. What I'm telling you is that, you know, this person because his father was using contacts in the Taliban, so that would kind of personalize and therefore create a sense of empathy with that individual story. And I think you're absolutely right that particularly with migrants and refugees, that it can become a very depersonalized kind of story. And then just on a very practical level, actually, so many people that we interviewed had very real needs for mental health counseling, and it was very difficult to give people access to that. And so, you know, we've reached out to groups at Columbia, whereby there could be appropriate services provided in, you know, the relevant languages, and who are also sensitive to LGBT.
Devote a week in your 14-week course on refugees. In an English literature class, have students read a poem or a short novel on refugees and maybe show this movie. So leverage maybe we're changing our attitude, but we're preaching to the choir. But we're going to take to make Afghanistan better, to make Haiti better. But it's, you know, it's a long haul. How do we make Russia stop doing what it's doing so that Ukraine is better?
And go snacks, but you have to sit through 2 more minutes of information before that. So to Fernando and Graeme, thank you for what has been an insightful and thoughtful and compassionate discussion. Because if there's one of 3,000 takeaways I had from the movie, it was that we should be compassionate. And I think that some parts of American exceptionalism can manifest itself. We understand how lucky and happy they feel to be here, but they have lost something, and they may or may not have running water. At home doesn't mean that they don't desperately miss their home, and if they have their brothers, would actually go back. So we should remember that in how we welcome people, that they have left something very important to. I obviously want to thank the audience for joining us for the LGBT Center's annual Mark D. Gordon lecture and the Perry Waldhouse Global Lens Arts and Cultural Series. And thank you to the Wolf Humanities Center for co-sponsoring the program.